bem-vindos a uma nova edição do Caminhos para o Mundo, programa do Brasil de Fato em parceria com a Assembleia Internacional dos Povos, que traz sempre temas atuais sobre a política internacional e a luta dos movimentos populares em todo o mundo. No programa de hoje, vamos discutir o conflito na Ucrânia, suas principais causas e consequências para o mundo. No dia 24 de fevereiro, a Rússia anunciou a invasão da Ucrânia, dizendo que seu objetivo era garantir que o país vizinho não entrasse na OTAN, a Aliança do Atlântico Norte. Além disso, o presidente russo Vladimir Putin afirmou que pretendia desnazificar o leste ucraniano. Na prática, a ocupação já dura cerca de 3 meses e parece dar início a uma nova etapa das relações geopolíticas internacionais. Para aprofundar esse tema, conversamos com Brian Becker. Brian, bem-vindo ao nosso programa.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Brian Becker é fundador do Partido pelo Socialismo e Libertação, PSL, dos Estados Unidos e apresentador do podcast de notícias The Socialist Program with Brian Becker. Ele é um pacifista de longa data e foi articulador de mobilizações de massa antiguerra em Washington durante toda a última década. Ele também é diretor da Answer, Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, e do Answer Coalition, um grupo de protesto composto por diversas organizações anti-guerra e de direitos civis dos Estados Unidos. Esse grupo foi criado 3 dias após os ataques de 11 de setembro de 2001. Brian, a imprensa comercial costuma apontar a Rússia como única culpada pela guerra na Ucrânia. Porém, cada vez mais analistas vêm expondo nos últimos tempos a responsabilidade não só dos Estados Unidos, como também da OTAN no aumento das tensões entre os dois países. Qual o papel histórico dos Estados Unidos e da OTAN nessa guerra?
This is the most important question because all of us who care about peace and who want to end the war, which is the most urgent requirement, need to understand how the war began, what caused the war, what the several dimensions of the war are. Because unless you understand what caused the Russian invasion, you won't be able to really understand what the path to peace is in Ukraine. Because the Russian invasion on February 24th was not simply a spontaneous action. It wasn't as if the Russian government got up one day and said, hey, let's go invade Ukraine. Let's have a major war on our border. No, that's not what happened. In order to understand why Russia took this extreme action, which the Russian government knew with full knowledge would invite very heavy sanctions, the attempt and the actual implementation of a plan to evict Russia from the world economy, to cut Russia off. In other words, a decision that would have very far-reaching consequences for Russia and Russians. The obvious fact is that the Russian government was concerned that unless Ukraine remained outside of NATO, that Russia would face an existential threat that would never end. Because for Ukraine to come into NATO means that a country, Ukraine, that shares a 1,200-mile-long border with Russia would be the staging ground for the placement of advanced US conventional and nuclear missiles all along Russia's border. That, the Russians said, was a red line, that it was unacceptable, and that they insisted that the West, and that the United States in particular, give them a guarantee that Ukraine would not become a staging ground for these kind of military operations. That's what neutrality means from the point of view of Russia. This is also in the context of three very important events. One, in February 2014, a coup d'etat took place in Ukraine that overthrew the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. That was February 22nd, 2014. Armed militias stormed the parliament, dispersed the government, and tried to kill the president, and he fled the country for his life. And when that happened, the US officials, Democrats and Republicans, including members of the Secretary of State of the State Department, Victoria Nuland in particular, said this was a great day for Ukrainian democracy, that this was a wonderful new chapter opening. And the new government immediately announced that it wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO. The second event was in 2018, where the US announced a new military doctrine that replaced the military doctrine that had been established after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And the new military doctrine said the war on terror, which had been the operational military doctrine for the US, was no longer the existing and operational doctrine. The new doctrine was to prepare America for major power conflict, which only means war with Russia or China. And then the third event was in 2019. The United States unilaterally canceled the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which banned the placement of missiles on either Russia or America's borders, missiles that had a flight time, as I said, of 6 or 7 minutes to their targets, a range of 300 to 600 miles. So Russia said in December 2021, just 6 months ago, 5 months ago, we're not going to let this happen. We're not going to become this vulnerable. We really mean it. We're serious. These are red lines. And to show that we're serious, we're amassing 150,000 Russian troops in Russia and in Belarus, surrounding the eastern and northern part of Ukraine, and demanding negotiations with the US, to which the United States said that the Russian demands were, quote, non-starters, meaning the US was not going to negotiate, absolutely not going to negotiate. And during those same months, poured in several billions of dollars more weapons to Ukraine.
Após a dissolução da União Soviética em 1991, quais foram as mudanças na política externa dos Estados Unidos e como isso se relaciona com o imperialismo como hoje nós o conhecemos?
Well, during the whole period between 1945 and 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, there was in the world what might be called bipolar power, meaning the United States and the major capitalist countries constituted one camp, one power. And on the other side was the Soviet Union and the socialist camp. Before World War II ended, the Soviet Union was the only socialist government. After World War II, it was the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, North Vietnam, North Korea, and then the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Albania, and East Germany. And those countries were aligned with the Soviet Union. So you had two powers. And so that created a certain equilibrium in the world situation. And the third world basically benefited from this bipolarity, because if the US imposed sanctions or an attempt to isolate a third world country, or say Cuba could turn towards the socialist camp. And instead of being isolated and blockaded and crushed, they could go to the other global power, which was not simply a military power, it was an integrated economic bloc. And then the Soviet Union collapsed and the socialist camp collapsed, and there became an era of unipolar power. And it was at that time that the United States shifted its whole orientation and decided and adopted a program which was outlined in something called the white paper that was released to the New York Times in 1991, 1992, written by Paul Wolfowitz, who later became a major figure in the George W. Bush administration. And this new doctrine essentially outlined that the United States would use its unipolar power and its gargantuan capacity, military capacity, to prevent any other rival from ever emerging once again that would be a check on American unipolar power. And so the US began a rampage around the world. It attacked Iraq, and of course the invasion of Afghanistan, the destruction of Libya, the attempted destruction of Syria. All of the anti-colonial, all the governments that owed their existence to the anti-colonial phase after World War II, where oppressed nations were fighting for national liberation and could turn to the socialist camp. Even if they were not socialists, they could get aid and economic assistance and trade and diplomatic support and military support. And so the US decided to destroy all of these post-colonial governments because they could, because there was no power to check them.
Brian, por que essa escolha da OTAN pelo confronto e não por uma parceria pacífica com a Rússia?
The NATO's ridiculous and irrational policy of endless expansion towards Russia can only be explained on the basis that, one, the European countries in NATO are not the real power in NATO, because they did not desire to have strained relations with Russia. I mean, Russia is part of Eurasia. Russia is their neighbor. They wanted to have good relations with Russia and benefit from economic ties with Russia, especially when it comes to energy, oil and natural gas, which Russia has huge quantities of. But the United States does not want Europe to become independent. It does not want Europe to become independent in a way that European powers, especially Germany, would gravitate in the direction of having close relations with Russia. Because then not only will the US not be the unipolar power in the world, but the United States post-World War II united front, whereby all of the capitalist countries in Europe and Japan were basically under the thumb of the United States and functioning not as nothing more than junior partners to the United States. And then Russia finally responds militarily on February 24th, and the US says, look, Russia is the aggressor. Russia is barbaric. Russia is violating human rights. Russia is threatening European security. And on that basis, it harnessed all of the European countries under American support. So now Germany and France, who were skeptics about NATO's expansion, are now completely with America against Russia. Finland, which was neutral and is right on Russia's border and just minutes away from St. Petersburg, Finland now says it wants to join NATO. Sweden, which has also not been a member of NATO, now says, yes, we'll join NATO too. So this was the Russian invasion was very helpful to the United States in terms of consolidating its control over Europe, which brings us back to the question, why did the US not negotiate when the Russians were saying in December, January, February of the last 5 months, please listen to us, we're serious, these are red lines, make sure Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO. Why did the US just say no, 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 and instead of meeting Russia and negotiating in good faith, sent more weapons, billions of weapons to to Ukraine as a sign to Russia that it would never negotiate. Why did the US do this? Because the US wants this war. The US wanted the Russian invasion. They put Russia in a corner. I think it was a mistake tactically on the part of the Russians to invade, because if the Russians, instead of invading, had continued to promote the idea that it was America that was threatening Europe with global conflict, it could have separated some of the populations in Europe away from American propaganda and separated some of the European countries from the US political orientation. The Soviet foreign policy was very clear from Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev all the way up to the end. Don't pursue a policy that lets all the imperialists unite against us, against the Soviet Union. And by invading Ukraine, Russia has allowed the imperialists to unite against Russia. So in addition to the tragic loss of life in Ukraine and the tragic loss of life for Russian soldiers, I believe that at least in the short term, this has strengthened the position of the United States.
Hoje nós temos no programa a participação especial de Thales Schmidt, editor de temas internacionais do Brasil de Fato. Ele tem uma pergunta para o Brian. Thales, muito bem-vindo ao nosso programa.
O combate a grupos neonazistas é central na defesa de Putin de sua invasão da Ucrânia. A iniciativa de Putin foi a mais adequada? Suas decisões foram estratégicas no sentido de dar uma resposta à OTAN?
Well, Russia said we have two goals, to denazify the country and to demilitarize the country. If those were the goals, I think they have not succeeded, because the Nazis, the fascists, the Azov battalion, who were really an important but minority part of the population, now appear to be the valiant heroes fighting to defend Ukrainian sovereignty against an aggression, against an invasion. So I think the stature of the fascists in Ukraine has gone up, not down. And whether Ukraine is going to be demilitarized, no. Ukraine is going to be additionally militarized. And if there is eventually, and there will be at some point, an agreement, even if the Russians win and let's say Donbass becomes independent or decides like Crimea did to be part of Russia, the rest of Ukraine is going to be completely under the control of the United States and NATO. And the fascists will look like, as I said, valiant heroes. So the Russian military operation was, I think, it was perplexing. I think the reason the Russians did not simply attack the Donbass, which you could make a greater argument for, because the Russian-speaking population had been so destroyed, or was being killed. But they came from the south. They came from the north. They had, thousands or tens of thousands of troops coming from Belarus down towards Kiev, the capital. And I think their goal was, their intelligence assessment was that the Zelensky government would crumble, it would fall apart, Zelensky might run away, and that there were Ukrainian parties that very much opposed Zelensky's program and opposed NATO. Real major political parties in Ukraine, including the former parties that have been ousted. And I think the Russian goal was that these Ukrainian parties would take the power in Ukraine, in Kiev, and that they would declare Ukraine to be a neutral country, and that they would then have normal and good relations with Russia, and the civil war against Russian-speaking people in the East would end, and that new Ukrainian government would then really attack or denazify the country by attacking the Azov battalion. At the end of the day, Ukraine, the West and the center of Ukraine will be part of NATO. They're going to be a staging ground for advanced weapons. The German and French skepticism to NATO will have been overcome, at least for the time being. So I think this was, I think that was the military calculation. Ukraine would fall quickly. When it didn't fall, I think the Russians had to reevaluate, reassess, refocus. So I feel politically, it's very bad. I mean, I have to be honest. That's my assessment. Of course, we don't know how this will end. War is dynamic. I do believe that in all likelihood, since the Americans want the war and want the war to continue, and the Russians are determined not to lose, I believe the likelihood is that the war will escalate. And I think for people who care about peace around the world, we should be insisting and demanding from our governments that the Americans return to the negotiating table, meet Russia's legitimate security demands, not use Ukraine and Ukrainians as a pawn on somebody else's big geostrategic chessboard, allow Ukrainians to live in peace by bringing a war to an end. And the only path to peace is that path, the path towards negotiations. The other path is leading to escalation.
Brian, quais respostas a classe trabalhadora global pode oferecer no sentido de estabelecer a paz mundial?
Well, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote, the workers of the world should unite. And that's always the biggest, most difficult problem in a way, is to how to build solidarity between workers who are coming from different nations, maybe looking a little bit different, speaking different, maybe having different religions. And the elites of these different nations are perfectly happy to have we, the working class, go and kill other workers from other nationalities. And at the end of the day, the elites say, look, we're all in this together. We're all Americans, or we're all French, or we're all Germans. Where the concept of socialism is to break people away from this kind of narrow nationalism and to say, we're not all one people. We might be one society, but our societies are divided into classes between the very rich, between the elites, between the corporations, between the banks. In the United States, that system which demands unipolar power, it's not unipolar power for workers in Kansas City. It's unipolar power for American banks and American-owned multinational corporations. And those corporations look at the rest of the world as a place for exploitation and to make super profits. So you have American workers in Michigan being told at one moment, put your hand on your heart, say the Pledge of Allegiance, be patriotic, salute the flag. We're all in this together. And then the same American corporations in Michigan say, thank you very much for your work from the past 30 years, but now we're taking our factory to Mexico or to China or somewhere else where we can pay workers 1/10 of what we paid you. And suddenly we're not all Americans anymore. We're just like oppressed and oppressor classes. And so the idea in a complicated world where we're constantly being appealed to on a narrow nationalism, I don't mean the nationalism of love of country or culture or people, but a narrow nationalism where we're supposed to be saluting and supporting the agenda, the global agenda of our own elites. We have to break free from that. And the only way that can happen is for there to be a socialist movement with that message and with persuasive arguments that explain the class nature of society and thus the class nature of the foreign policy of each government. The war policy is an extension of the domestic policy. In the United States, where Black people are so horribly oppressed and were formerly the enslaved working class that created the riches of the bourgeoisie, or the immigrant population who are super exploited, or the other parts of the population, the working class in America, 1 out of every 2 Americans now in the richest country in the world lives either in or near poverty. 1 out of every 2, according to the Poor People's Campaign. We have to be able, and we are trying and organizing to say the foreign policy of the United States and the war policy of the United States are the policies of the same class of capitalists and bankers, the billionaire class, that's oppressing us here at home. And instead of being wrapped up and won over and drawn into the war hysteria generated by our own oppressors, we have to expose that the war is a rich man's war. The war is a war for expansion and profit and domination against other workers. And I think this is a hard job for the left, but it's the job, because we're moving towards existential crisis. One, climate catastrophe caused by the same ruling class, endless war and growing war and global war, major power conflict. That's a second one. And of course, the way technology is being brought into the workplace with artificial intelligence, workers whose jobs are being replaced by computers, they're told, thank you very much. We don't have any obligation to you. We're going to replace you with a machine. Like, these are existential crises facing society: war, climate change, and of course, the capitalist basis for introducing new technology, which doesn't liberate us from, we want new technology so workers are not beasts of burden. But under capitalism, where all production is designed solely to maximize profit for the owner, the employer class, technology replaces workers who are then considered to be unnecessary. So they face either extreme poverty or imprisonment in the United States. So these are the tasks: to build a conscious movement, not simply an activist movement, but a conscious movement of international solidarity.
Brian Becker, muito obrigada pela sua análise. Eu espero poder recebê-lo mais vezes aqui no nosso programa.
Thank you so much. Great honor and pleasure to be with you.
O Caminhos para o Mundo termina aqui. Para rever este ou outros programas, basta acessar o canal do Brasil de Fato no YouTube e acompanhar a gente na TVT. Um abraço e até a próxima!